Welcome to another edition of Eye on the Issues. Today we are talking with Matthew Mitchell. He is with the Fraser Institute, also with the Mercatus Center. And how are you doing today, Matthew?
I'm great. How are you?
Excellent, excellent. So this is a really interesting topic today. It's basically looking at government and looking at the public sector and how do they intertwine possibly to benefit business, benefit taxes, benefit communities. Let me dive right into this first question. You wrote a paper with the Mercatus Center a few years ago, which found that corporate tax breaks and subsidies don't help growth or may even depress economic activity. What's the economic logic behind this conclusion?
Yeah, so there's a couple of reasons. One of them, it might help perhaps to start with the intuition of why you would think an economic development, incentive or subsidy would work. Often these things are done as sort of tax privileges. If you come here, you don't have to pay a certain tax, or maybe we'll even transfer the revenue that is collected to your firm. And so this idea here, I think, has a lot of intuition. It basically gets at the idea that taxes discourage economic development. So now, why would standard economic theory tell us actually that it doesn't work in a targeted sense? The reason is that taxes not only discourage economic activity, but the economic damage that's done from a tax is actually it rises with the square of the rate, which sounds a little technical, but the basic intuition here is that if you double the tax, you quadruple the damage that's done with it. And this happens because taxes not only raise costs that consumers have to pay, but they also discourage economic activity. And so what happens is if you imagine you have 100 firms in a city, and you have two ways of taxing them. One is a 5% across the board tax that every firm pays. The other one is a 10% tax that half the firm pays and 0% tax that the other half pays. That system where you concentrate more of the burden on a smaller number of firms actually causes more economic damage. And it does because of this problem of the fact that the economic damage done from a tax rises with the square of its rate. And so because of this, whenever you have a targeted economic development incentive that offers a particular break to some firms, that leaves other firms with higher tax rates. So even though it's great, you might be encouraging some economic activity on one margin by sparing some, privileged firms, you end up creating more damage for the rest. There are other problems, though. Another problem associated with this is that what you end up doing is you might encourage economic activity that shouldn't happen. So the idea here is that, with enough economic development subsidies, you could get, high alpine places like Wyoming or high desert places like Wyoming, to have a beach scene, right? You could do it. You have enough economic development incentives that you encourage firms to somehow create, big domes, and you'd have to bring in a whole lot of water. And yes, you could do it, but it just doesn't make sense because that's not the comparative advantage of Wyoming, right? And so if you encourage firms to do things that they wouldn't otherwise do, while it might in the short run look like you're encouraging economic development, you're actually encouraging bad behavior. And then the final reason is the more you do this, the more you encourage firms to seek privileges. And we economists call this rent seeking. But you encourage firms to expend scarce resources trying to defend their privileges, seeking privileges, obtaining privileges, getting cozy with politicians, rather than focusing their efforts on just creating value for consumers. So those are the sort of three main reasons.
Very interesting. So, how would an interstate compact to end corporate welfare work?
Yeah, so the basic idea here is, whenever I make the argument that I just made, especially to policymakers, I often hear policymakers say, well, what would you have us do? Because, we can't unilaterally disarm. The state next door already, is offering incentives. And so if we unilaterally disarm, that'll harm us. the economics of it again still suggest you really should unilaterally disarm and make sense to do so because you're harming yourself. But even if you feel like politically you can't do that, I can understand that. I can sympathize with that. But an interstate commerce, an interstate compact actually sort of permits policymakers to get around that political problem. Through an interstate compact, policymakers can say, we will agree to forego our subsidies so long as other states forgo theirs. Interstate compacts have actually, they're a part of the Constitution. You can sort of think of them as a level between states making policy themselves versus the federal government making the policy. The states can agree with one another on policy levels, sort of like international treaties. And so we have interstate compacts in a lot of areas, water rights, and pollution and things like that. It really makes, in my view, quite a lot of sense for states to form interstate compacts on this type of an economic um, policy where they essentially would say, like, if you join our compact, and once you join the compact, you don't have to, all the states within the compact agree to forego subsidies. We see actually quite successful or semi-successful versions of this in Canada. Canada has in some ways, a worse constitution in the sense that it doesn't, it permits states to put barriers to trade. And so to get around that, the provinces have created some of the provinces have joined interstate compacts or interprovincial compacts that limit that.
Very interesting. It makes me think a little bit of the movie industry. New Mexico, a number of years ago, 10, 20 years ago, started giving these massive tax breaks to these Hollywood producers to come out there and make movies. Now, a lot of other states are doing the same thing, maybe whether it be Texas, maybe even Louisiana and some others.
Yeah, that's right. And that's one of the better studied examples of target economic development incentives. And I live in New Mexico. I can tell you it hasn't created prosperity. New Mexico is one of the least economically free states in the union. And it is also one of the lowest income states in the union.
Yeah, yeah, very good point. Whereabouts in New Mexico do you live?
Oh, I live up in the mountains, not too far from Taos, not too far from Colorado.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Okay. Yep. There's actually a ski resort up that way that's no longer open. Well, it's not open right now anyhow, but it closed years ago. A friend of mine used to kind of babysit it on top of a mountain. I forget the name of it, but it made
Oh,
kind
that's great. Yeah. Yeah. I live in near the ski town of Angel Fire is my location.
Oh, okay. Yep. I was just in Angel Fire a couple weeks ago. Very
Oh,
nice.
awesome. Awesome.
So Section 6, I'm gonna read something here to you and then give you a reaction.
Yeah.
Section 6 of the Wyoming Constitution says, quote, neither the state nor any county, city, township, town, school district, or any other political subdivision shall, quote, loan or give its credit or make donations to or in aid of any individual association or corporation except for necessary support of the poor. Do you think this legal statute could be used to push back against corporate welfare in Wyoming?
Well, it was designed exactly for that purpose. In the 1800s, several states got in economic and financial trouble with targeted economic development incentives. A number of states actually essentially defaulted on their debts, and it was a big problem. They went to the federal government, for a bailout. The federal government said no, and so in response, states started adopting these anti-aid provisions like this. They adopted credit clauses, stock clauses, gift clauses that basically said the government is not supposed to provide any type of targeted aid to an individual or to a firm. So in principle, yes, that's exactly what the Wyoming Constitution should prohibit. However, there's a problem. So Article 16, sections 12 and 13 of that create big exceptions specifically for the idea of economic development. So Article 16, Section 12 of the Wyoming Constitution permits loan and loan guarantees for economic development. Article 16, Section 13 permits local revenue sources to be used in economic development. These are provisions that were adopted in 2004 and 2006, and they essentially sort of neuter the state's otherwise quite strong anti-aid provisions.
Mm-hmm. All right. And when a company announces a heavily subsidized project, what questions do you think the public should be asking about the project?
That's a great question. So, I mean, one is, would this project happen in the absence of subsidies? Because, of course, We know that something like 75 to 98% of all subsidized economic activities actually would have happened anyway. They should also be asking about what's the opportunity cost? How much money is being spent on this one, privilege, whether it's an outright subsidy or a tax privilege, and what could we do with that otherwise? So you can relatively, run the numbers actually relatively easily and figure, okay, what major tax could we cut in the absence of this? By how much could we cut it? And, how does it affect our competitiveness in terms of other states? I think those are important questions. I'll point out something that maybe a question that people think should be asked, but maybe shouldn't be. Often people want to know how many jobs are going to be created with this. The problem with that is, and it kind of gets at this idea of, at the beginning of our conversation, why does this cause a problem? Well, there are some activities that just shouldn't happen, right? And so if you create the necessity that in order to obtain a privilege or obtain this target economic development incentive, you have to create a certain number of jobs, that'll incentivize firms to create jobs even if they don't need the jobs. So to give it a notorious example, when the state of Wisconsin subsidized Foxconn, Foxconn ended up, in order to meet their job targets, they hired a bunch of 20-year-olds, put them in rooms with iPads and told them to watch Netflix for days on end. That is not creating any economic value for the state of Wisconsin. It's not creating value for consumers. If you just focus too much on the idea of creating a job, that's a real problem.
Yeah. Years ago in Albuquerque, in New Mexico, matter of fact, I remember there was a small plane manufacturer that the city really wanted to stay there and really wanted to keep jobs in the area. And it ended up going bust eventually. I don't think it ever produced any airplanes, but same kind of concept there.
Yep.
So let me
Yep.
ask you this. So how often do you think the decision to subsidize a business is actually the deciding factor? Because in some cases, you've got these businesses that have a lot of money, but they still get these subsidies.
Yeah. So first of all, this is an extremely difficult question to study because both those who give away the subsidies and those who receive the subsidies have a strong incentive to claim, oh, of course, we wouldn't have done this. We wouldn't have located here but for the subsidy. But our best guess, based on some surveys, based on some economic modeling, is that somewhere between 75 and 98% of the time, the firm would have made the decision even in the absence of the subsidy. So it's a pretty, I think there's pretty decent evidence that suggests that this is wasted money.
Right, exactly. Now, what am I not asking you that you think is important here?
Oh, it's a good question. I think I would just go back to the initial idea that there's sort of this difference between what's economically reasonable and what is politically possible. A lot of policymakers find themselves in a bind because they feel like, the whole race to try to outcompete other states, is so competitive. They really just don't want to be unilaterally disarming, and they don't want or look like they're unilaterally disarming, and they don't want to look like they have that they're doing nothing. So that's where and this is, to be honest, is a little harder for a state like Wyoming that already has a good number of policies, one of the best most competitive tax codes in the country, relatively high levels of economic freedom. But you're already sort of doing the path that works. That we know this from hundreds of peer-reviewed economic studies that greater economic freedom tends to be associated with greater economic development. And so, pursue that path, lean in on what's working for you and try to eschew the things that just don't work, the shiny objects of target economic development incentives.
Very interesting. I remember the name, by the way, of the ski resort, Ski Rio. Ever heard of it?
Yeah, I do think I have heard of it. See, yeah,
Big
I think it
house,
closed a few
head
years
for the
ago.
Colorado state line. You pass.
Yes. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
anyhow, well, Matthew, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. Folks out there, if you want to learn more about what's happening around the state of Wyoming, just go to wyliberty.org, sign up for our newsletter. Matthew, thanks again. Great information. I hope we can talk again.
Sounds great. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
You bet.